And welcome back. As we go ahead and now wrap up our section on conditionals, pretty much we have looked at two different types. We've looked at if-else statements and we've looked at switch statements, but there is of course some equivalency that we can do between them, and so we could convert between using an if-else or a switch statement, and of course there are times when one is going to be more beneficial over the other. So the question we have to ask is, do we want to use a switch statement or do we want to use an if-else statement? Well, we have looked at both types of these branches, and both of them have advantages over another. A switch statement is typically more efficient than, let's say, a nested if statement. So if you're looking for efficiency, a switch statement is always going to be down because of how it builds it up for the compiler. Now, while the choice typically depends on readability of code and what expression is being tested, there are several reasons to choose one option over the other. So when we look at these two, if we look at the side by side here, we have an if-else versus a switch. When we look at an if-else statement, the thing you have to understand with an if-else is that it's testing a range of values. The way you can think about this is, are we using an inequality? If we're using an inequality, then an if-else is going to be the option we want to choose because we're looking over a range of values. So for example, we want to see if a number is positive. That is a range of values that we can check over. Whereas with a switch, we're going to test a single or a specific value. So for example, I want to see if x is 0. That is a specific value. Or maybe I'm going to get a number from a user, and if that number matches one that's in my database, then I can use a switch statement for that. If we look at if-else, again, they are going to be better for testing Boolean values. Booleans, of course, are true and false. And a lot of times these are coming from, if you think about how we made our Boolean expressions, we're testing to see if some sort of expression is true. And so with that being said, an if-else is going to work better for that. And again, using things like inequalities are going to be better for that. Or we start looking at our compound expressions and stuff like that. However, with the switch, these are much better for primitive types and strings because, again, we can look for specific values. So, for example, I want to look at a list of names and I want to determine what name is it going to be. This is where a switch statement might be stronger. Also, with if-else statements, the thing you have to understand is that when it goes and compiles your code, the compiler has no knowledge of a multi-way branch. So, for example, you have an if, an else if, maybe another else if, and an else. It doesn't know what those values are until it evaluates each branch. So each branch has to be evaluated prior before it can move down to the next level of that conditional to determine what value does it need to test. Whereas you compare that to a switch statement, these are much better on their multi-way branches because the values are already known. Because remember, we're using specific values. So because those values are already known, this is typically going to run much faster than if we start looking at like 5 comparisons. Anything under 5, you can use an if-else pretty easily. But if you start exceeding that and you know you have specific values, these items are all going to have the same access time. Because again, what it's doing is building a table effectively of all the things it needs to look for. And so it only looks for those values rather than having to evaluate something to determine where it wants to move. So let's go ahead and look at this, though, with an example of how do we take an if statement, for example, and rewrite it. And then we'll look at this with a switch. So if we start with an if statement, first thing I want to stress is that not all conditional statements can be written. If you look at our two examples previously, for example, we said like, hey, an if statement is using typically a Boolean expression. A lot of times we're using that for inequalities. You can't really use those with switch statements. However, if we look at one that we can rewrite, if here we look at this example, as if x equals 2, we're just printing out x is 2, else if x is 0, we're printing out x is 0, otherwise x is some other value. Notice in each of these test cases here, each of these are a very specific value, so we can very easily translate that to a switch statement. All right, and when we go to look at that conversion, you're going to see how each of these correspond from the if statements into a case that is for that switch. So if we look at the equivalent switch statement, we can see that our switch is now the variable x because x has a specific value that we're going to test. And that could be a value that's already defined in our program, or maybe it's one we're getting from user input. However, that is the variable we want to use. So we don't have to necessarily plug in a number there because we can use a variable. And then what that case statements are going to do is evaluate what value is actually in that variable. So I have case 2, case 0, because remember we had a if x equals 2, x equals 0. Here, it's the same thing. We have system out println x is 2, break, case 0, system out println x is 0, break. And then we have our default. Remember, the default I have mentioned is very similar to how our else works. So this is kind of our catch-all, our bucket here for these situations. So this is where we get x is some other value. And so now here I am with a example here. And let's go ahead and do this the other way. We're going to build this through rather than just giving you the code. So here I have a switch statement, and I want to convert this over to an if statement. Again, this is not something you may not do very often, but just want to show you how this process works. So if we look here, we have int num1, num2, two variables, which is existing in a program. We have our switch set to num1. We have case 0, case 1, and we have our default, which means if I look at this, if I'm going to build out an equivalent if statement, I need to ask myself, how many cases do I have? Well, I have a total of 3 cases, which means I'm probably going to need an if, an else if, and an else. The else, of course, corresponding to the default. So let's start with our top one, case 0. So we're just going to say if, and we look to see what is my variable that I'm testing. Well, in this case, the switch variable is that case that I want to change it to the variable for the if statement. So this would be num1. And because we know these are specific values, we're going to use equals, equals, and we're going to use 0. And then we just say, okay, what's inside of that case statement? Well, we just have a print line here. So we're just going to add that equivalent print line, and then we repeat. So now we're going to do an else if, and we're going to say num1 equals equals 1. And then we'll do the same thing. We have num1 is 1. Perfect. Now you notice one advantage here, we don't have the keyword break here. So that is one thing to keep in mind. But we may have other things that we may have to deal with. And then, of course, our else is just going to correspond to the default. And if we run this, we should see the same thing, right? Num1 is 0, num1 is 0, because these are equivalent. Now, I did put the second variable in here because I just want to show you that with the switch statement, we can't necessarily work that the same thing as an if. So if I were just to add a simple if statement here, so let's just say if num1 is less than num2, all right? And I'm just going to have it just very simple, just print out something here. Let's just have it say num1 is smaller. And just for comparison, let's just add in an else statement here. And we'll do system.out.println. We'll say num1 is equivalent or larger. Now, the one thing we have to keep in mind, remember that this will not convert to a switch statement. I'll show you why. So if we go ahead and try to write a switch statement down here. So if we do a switch, remember a switch has to have a value that's going to be a type, right? That's going to be like, say, integer, a double, a switch. So if I try to use the same kind of expression that I have here, num1 is less than num2, because remember, that's equivalent here. We have case 0, num1 equals 0. If I try to do something here equivalent, right, the thing you're going to find out is as soon as I try to do this, you notice we get an error here. And it says right here, cannot switch on a type Boolean. Because remember, switch statements don't handle Booleans. So this is why when I say when we start dealing with anything with inequalities, it's actually going to be better for us to actually deal with an if-else statement because it can handle that. That's when the if-else statement is a better structure to use versus that of a switch statement. But if we have something specific and we know those values, we can easily build that out with a switch statement because it's more built up to handle that.